The cafe was alive with the gentle hum of conversation, the clinking of cups, and bursts of laughter from groups of friends and families scattered around. In one brightly decorated corner, balloons swayed softly above a small table. At that table sat a little girl, no older than 8, her delicate frame settled in a wheelchair. She wore a pink birthday dress, its frilly sleeves framing her small shoulders, and a thin silver tiara that rested slightly crooked on her head. Before her sat a perfectly decorated cake, its frosting a swirl of pastel colors, topped with unlit candles waiting for a wish. Her hands rested in her lap as she gazed at it quietly, the sparkle in her eyes dimmed by the emptiness around her. Her father, the city's well-known CEO, stood at the cafe's counter, his voice low but firm into his phone. His sharp suit and polished shoes spoke of power and success, yet in this moment, his attention was locked on the conversation, not the little girl behind him. Every now and then, her eyes darted toward him, hoping he might return soon, but he never looked back. All around her, strangers enjoyed each other's company, clinking glasses, sharing jokes, leaning in close. Yet at her table, there was only silence, a small island of stillness in a sea of life. The girl glanced at the candles once more, her lips curving into a faint, almost invisible smile, as if she were telling herself it was okay, even though it wasn't. The cafe's door swung open with a gentle chime, letting in a rush of cool air from outside. A tall man stepped in, carrying a small paper bag of pastries in one hand and holding the other tightly around his son's. The boy, maybe 7, was full of restless energy, his sneakers squeaking lightly on the polished floor as he scanned the bustling room. They moved toward an empty table, but the boy's gaze suddenly locked on the far corner. There, he saw her. The girl in the pink dress, sitting so still beside a cake that hadn't been touched. He slowed his steps, tugging at his father's hand. "Dad," he whispered, his voice curious yet soft, "why is she all alone on her birthday?" The man followed his son's gaze, taking in the scene in an instant. The wheelchair. The untouched cake. The way her eyes seemed to search the room for someone who wasn't coming. His steps faltered, a quiet ache pressing against his chest. He looked down at his son, whose wide, earnest eyes were waiting for an answer. For a moment, he said nothing, just breathing in the truth of what he saw. Then, he smiled gently, squeezing his boy's hand. "I'm not sure," he murmured, "but maybe we should find out." Instead of sitting at their own table, they turned, walking toward the lonely corner. Each step felt deliberate, like a choice, not just to approach her, but to change whatever story this day might have been. The little girl noticed them approaching, her posture straightening slightly in her wheelchair. She glanced toward the counter where her father still stood, deep in conversation, then back at the man and boy who now stood by her table. The man offered a warm, unhurried smile. "Hi there," he said gently, his voice carrying a kindness that seemed to soften the air between them. "My son and I were about to eat our pastries, but your cake looks way better. Mind if we join you?" For a second, the girl hesitated, her eyes flickering with surprise. No one outside of her father had spoken to her since she came in. She glanced at the boy, who was already grinning, holding up his little paper bag like it was an invitation to a secret club. "Sure," she said softly, the single word almost shy but filled with relief. The boy slid into the seat beside her without hesitation, leaning toward the cake. "Whoa, that's the coolest cake I've ever seen. Are those butterflies made of chocolate?" he asked, eyes wide. Her lips curved into a real smile for the first time that afternoon. "Yes, and you can have one if you want." They laughed together, their voices rising above the quiet hum of the cafe. The man sat across from them, simply watching for a moment, his chest warming at the sight. In a corner once filled with silence, there was now chatter, laughter, and something else, something that felt a lot like joy finding its way back. At the counter, the CEO's phone call finally ended. He slipped the device into his jacket pocket and turned toward his daughter's table, expecting to see her sitting quietly as before. But the sight that met his eyes stopped him mid-step. She was laughing, really laughing, the kind of unguarded, bubbling laughter he hadn't heard in months. Her cheeks were flushed, her hands animated as she spoke to a boy he didn't recognize. Across from them sat a man, watching the children with an expression that was equal parts warmth and ease, as though he belonged in that moment. For a second, the CEO just stood there, the noise of the cafe fading into the background. He saw the cake, now with 2 small slices missing, the candles still unlit but no longer lonely. He saw the way his daughter's eyes sparkled, not because of anything he'd bought her, but because someone had simply chosen to be there. A twinge of guilt tightened in his chest. He thought of the meetings, the deadlines, the endless phone calls that seemed so urgent, and yet here was proof that the most important thing in his life could be missed in a heartbeat. He took a slow breath, adjusting his tie as if steadying himself, and began walking toward them, not as the city's most powerful CEO, but as a father who suddenly realized he'd been absent from the moments that mattered most. The CEO reached the table, his polished shoes silent against the cafe floor. The laughter between the 3 paused for a moment as they looked up at him. His daughter's face was glowing, her smile wide and unforced. "Dad," she said eagerly, "this is Ethan and his dad. They're helping me celebrate." The man across the table nodded politely. "Hope you don't mind, we saw she was alone and thought birthdays shouldn't be spent that way." The CEO swallowed the lump in his throat. For years, he'd been praised for his sharp decisions and strategic thinking, yet it took a stranger to remind him of something so simple, so deeply human. "Thank you," he said, his voice softer than he expected. "You have no idea how much this means." The boy leaned toward the cake. "We still haven't lit the candles," he exclaimed. The CEO smiled faintly, pulling out the lighter from the table's side. "Then let's fix that." He lit each candle slowly, his daughter watching with eyes that glistened. Not from the flickering flames, but from the feeling of being surrounded, seen, and included. They all sang together, their voices mingling into a melody that filled the corner with warmth. When she blew out the candles, her wish stayed secret, but her happiness was plain to see. Later that night, the CEO canceled a late meeting and took his daughter home, determined that she would never have to celebrate alone again.